You are being taught to trust stories instead of evidence, and you call it information. You watch headlines about gold, oil, and markets like it's weather, something happening to other people. But notice what always repeats. When the world feels unstable, the same type of leaders and institutions try to rebuild belief with symbols, guarantees, and carefully timed announcements, even when the proof is missing. This video is not about whether those claims are true or false in a literal mineralogical sense. It is about the psychological mechanism behind the performance. It is about how gold becomes a theater prop for power, how oil becomes a lever for compliance, and how entire countries behave like desperate borrowers trying to reassure creditors. The uncomfortable truth is that what's being traded may not only be metal or barrels, it may be confidence, and confidence is the real currency. Welcome to the hidden self, where we look at the part of human behavior that people hate admitting. The part that says, when fear rises, we don't just make decisions, we build narratives to survive them. And once you see that pattern, you start spotting it everywhere, including inside your own life, in your relationships, your money habits, and the way you react when you feel you might lose control. Let's start with the simplest form of the message. Imagine you wake up in a collapsing economy. Your housing bubble has burst, your exporters are slowing down, your currency is wobbling, and your markets feel like they're sliding off a cliff. People in the middle class begin to quietly panic, not with a scream, but with 1,000 small behaviors. They cut spending, they delay purchases, they refuse new commitments, they check the news obsessively, and they start asking family members whether they should move money, whether their job is safe, whether the future is still real or just a slogan. Now imagine the state has a choice. Either it admits vulnerability or it manufactures certainty. And certainty, in crises, is a survival drug. That's why when China announced 2 enormous gold discoveries within a single year, the timing mattered as much as the numbers. 2 alleged deposits, one in the south-central region around an inland lake and one in the northeast near Liaoning. The claim was not modest, it was astronomical. Each deposit was described as containing more than 1,000 tons of refined gold, and combined they were framed as a massive share of China's officially stated reserves. Whether the numbers are accurate is not the only question, and maybe not even the main one. The psychological question is why the announcement was loud, frequent, and synchronized with economic stress. When trust in institutions falls, people look for a substitute foundation. In financial history, gold is the oldest substitute. It's heavy, it's tangible, it cannot be printed. It cannot be deleted with a signature, at least not in theory. It carries the aura of permanence. So if you want to calm your population and reassure external actors, you don't just promise policy. You display a symbol that feels older than politics. Here's the micro story you should imagine. Picture a small business owner watching the news. They don't understand macroeconomics like a professor, but they understand one thing. If the ground shifts, their savings feel less real. They remember that paper wealth can vanish. They hear the rumor that a government found huge gold reserves, and suddenly their brain gets an emotional message. The state is not helpless. The state is holding something solid. Even if the owner cannot verify the assay results, even if they never see independent confirmation, the narrative itself works. It gives the owner permission to stop panicking. It turns fear into a manageable feeling. That's the same reason myths survive. Not because they are true, but because they reduce anxiety. But then the next layer appears, and it is where the script gets darker. Because across global news, there was also a missing ingredient: independent verification. In geology and resource extraction, the time from discovery to production is long. It involves drilling, sampling, testing, feasibility studies, regulatory hurdles, infrastructure, and risk. It is expensive. It is slow. Real mining is not a viral post. So if something feels too fast, too convenient, too perfectly timed to the emotional needs of a market, skepticism is not paranoia. Skepticism is intelligence. And yet, the performance continued. The announcements landed during a period when property failures were dragging down big companies, when exports were weakening, when the currency faced pressure, and when the public sense of market certainty was deteriorating. In that context, the question many analysts asked was not only, did they find gold? It was, are they creating belief faster than they can create proof? Think about how this resembles personal self-deception. People do the same thing in love. Someone tells you they are over their ex, but their behavior suggests they still live there. Someone claims they are stable, but they constantly provoke drama to avoid silence. Someone insists they don't care, yet they chase attention as if their identity depends on it. It's not that they consciously plan to lie. It's worse. They build a story that allows them to keep functioning. States can do it too, especially states with public credibility problems. When confidence is the resource being drained, the solution is not necessarily production. The solution is reassurance. Now let's escalate. The gold story inside the country might be one kind of message, but the broader behavior suggests a second mechanism. Gold accumulation across borders, at scale, even where transparency is minimal. This is where the narrative becomes action. Because if you want gold, you can mine it slowly, or you can reach for it through networks that don't care about moral optics and don't require long procurement cycles. Reports describe Chinese-linked operations in gold-rich African countries. The pattern described wasn't simply small-scale artisanal mining. It was industrial extraction using heavy machinery, processing infrastructure, and chemical methods described as hazardous and banned in certain jurisdictions. The claims also suggested armed protection for operations and the creation of networks that facilitate the movement of raw gold out of the region. And then the critical detail, the response when questioned. Authorities deny state responsibility, claiming actions are spontaneous citizen initiatives. That is a convenient explanation because it separates the behavior from accountability. It transforms what looks coordinated into something random. It says, in effect, we are not steering, we are merely watching. But here is the psychological tell. No spontaneous individual group can usually coordinate across borders with heavy equipment, logistics, chemical supply chains, and security assets that challenge local authorities unless there is institutional support in the background. A denial like that is not just a factual stance, it is a strategy for mental framing. It attempts to keep the public from connecting dots. Humans do this in their own lives. We see it when someone insists they just happened to meet a person that clearly was arranged through mutual networks. We see it when someone claims they didn't mean to manipulate you, while their pattern shows intention. We see it when an individual blames randomness to protect ego, because if they admit planning, they must admit responsibility. Similarly, if a government wants the benefits of power without the cost of accountability, it can outsource operations while preserving plausible deniability. It creates a fog, and fog is useful. Fog prevents people from asking the most dangerous question: who actually made it happen? Now compare that with the other player in this global gold chessboard, Russia. The psychological difference is not about morality, it's about motive and method. China, in this depiction, is described as mining influence and accumulating gold through extraction and networks that can scale. Russia is described as doing something more direct, using gold intertwined with geopolitical bargaining, trading access, security, and political recognition for mining rights. This is a brutal truth about how states think. When trust breaks, they do not fall back on ethics. They fall back on leverage. And leverage can be built out of anything: resources, security, legitimacy, alliances, and payments that avoid Western-controlled rails. So what is gold in this context? Not just wealth, not just decoration. Gold becomes a psychological anchor. It becomes a claim that says we are not entirely at the mercy of systems that can be frozen. It becomes insurance against financial violence. You already know this from your own life, even if you never named it. Think about the last time you felt unsafe, not physically unsafe necessarily, financially unsafe, socially unsafe, emotionally unsafe. In those moments, you didn't just want comfort, you wanted a guarantee. You wanted something that feels unbreakable. People who feel insecure chase security behaviors. They hoard, they over-control, they obsess, they seek legal certainty, they cling to tangible assets, they avoid risk because their nervous system demands a stabilizer. Gold is the stabilizer for nations in fear, and nations don't admit fear easily because fear threatens authority. So they disguise fear as strategy, as discovery, as destiny. Now let's go deeper into what the transcript calls the hidden inheritance of belief. Gold is a metal. In the lab, it's just a chemical element, but in the finance system, gold carries a meaning. It becomes an embodiment of trust. It is what people point to when they want to feel that money is not imaginary. That is why monetary history matters. Long ago, after the devastation of a global war, a new order was built with a clear story. The dollar would be anchored through gold at a fixed rate. That created a simple emotional promise. If the currency can be redeemed, it is not purely fantasy. People can relax because the system has a hard backstop. Then came the political pivot when the promise was removed. The dollar moved away from direct convertibility into a metal and became anchored by something else, not by gold, but by power, by economic dominance, and by coercive arrangements that tied crucial commodities, especially oil, to dollar transactions. This is where the psychology becomes uncomfortable, because when people criticize fiat money, they often talk as if it is only technical policy. But the truth is that most people accept money because it is socially enforced. They accept it because alternatives are blocked, because the world is designed so the easiest path uses the dominant currency. People can pretend they believe in the currency due to its strength, but much of the belief is actually embedded in institutional structure. So when a nation like China talks about gold accumulation and a new version of an older order, it's not just economics. It's a desire to re-anchor trust in a way that reduces reliance on Western-controlled guarantees. And Russia's motive is not expansion in the way empires romanticize. Russia's motive, in this framing, is survival after being hit with financial sanctions. The description was clear. Assets can be frozen. Currency rails can be cut. Payments can be disrupted. What you believed was yours becomes conditional. Once that happens, the psychological lesson is unforgettable for a government. If your wealth lives in systems you do not control, it is not wealth, it is a hostage. Now imagine a country learning that lesson while watching the world tell them they should comply. How do they respond? They do what you do when you feel trapped. They build a parallel world. They build alternative infrastructure. They seek assets that cannot be frozen as easily because the ownership is physical or harder to confiscate. That is one reason gold keeps returning like a recurring nightmare. In that framework, Russia uses gold to facilitate trade without touching constrained systems. If you can sell commodities to friendly buyers for gold, then use the gold to buy needed goods or technologies, you reduce the exposure to the dominant payment systems. Gold becomes the middle layer that turns barter logic into something that still functions in modern trade. And again, look at the psychological function. It is not only a transaction tool, it is a nervous system hack. It says, we can keep moving, we can keep buying, we can keep breathing. It reduces helplessness. Now we move from gold to oil, because if gold is the body's protection, oil is the heartbeat of the economy. Energy determines everything: production costs, industrial output, transportation, geopolitics, and the credibility of national planning. The transcript describes an attempt to reconfigure the oil market away from a structure dominated by petrodollars. The claim is that Russia and China are coordinating pressure on multiple levels. Russia through influence in OPEC plus the ability to adjust supply and prices, and China through payment alternatives and gold-backed guarantees. This is where the concept of Gulf swing momentum becomes useful metaphorically. In personal life, you also coordinate different tactics to shift outcomes. People who are controlling partners do not rely on one argument. They do it through timing, through threats, through affection, through silence, through financial control, through social pressure. They align their moves so that the target becomes confused and compliant. Nations can do the same at scale. In the transcript, OPEC is described as shifting production policy in a way that seems economically irrational, given market conditions of oversupply. If prices are low and supply is abundant, why expand further? The explanation offered is political warfare against shale oil producers, which require higher long-term prices to survive. Reduce sustained profitability, and you cripple an industry that the United States uses as an energy leverage tool. Not by invading, not by firing missiles, but by manipulating the economic environment until specific businesses collapse. Again, notice how this is psychological rather than merely financial. The goal is not only profit, the goal is to shape a future capability. It's about making an opponent less able to apply pressure later. It's a preemptive weakening of tools. And this pattern echoes in everyday sabotage. When people want to destroy your options, they don't always directly attack you. They restrict your resources, they damage your credit, they cut off your support, they convince others you are unreliable, they create a situation where your future choices shrink. Then they say, "See, you were never capable." They treat your limited options as proof you deserve them. Now, if you zoom back out to the global system, the transcript suggests a bigger plan: re-anchor commodity trade in non-dominant currency rails. If more oil transactions happen in local currencies rather than dollars, then the dollar loses a central advantage. Less demand for dollars weakens the dominant system. And that is not just an economic change. It changes political leverage. It changes the ability to fund wars and deficits through currency power. The terrifying part of this story is that it is not designed like a single battle. It is designed like an architecture project. It takes years, it builds networks, it uses contracts, it builds trust within a new club and weakens the old club by substituting alternatives. If you want to understand how the world ends up like this, don't start with missiles. Start with belief. Start with the way people behave when they think their current system is failing. Because when enough participants lose confidence, they stop cooperating with the old structure, even if it still functions on paper. They seek alternatives. They diversify. They hedge. They hoard. And then the old structure becomes brittle, because it requires trust to stay smooth. This is the psychological truth many people refuse to accept. Trust is not a moral virtue. Trust is a supply chain for stability. When it collapses, everything becomes expensive, slow, and violent. Even peaceful trade becomes a battleground. Now let's bring this close to your life, because the channel's hidden self-theme demands it. When you feel financially unstable, you start making decisions that look rational on the surface, but are driven by fear. You avoid spending, but then you spend compulsively on control, courses, gadgets, systems, subscriptions, anything that gives you the illusion of mastery. You chase a promise because anxiety is intolerable. You might not call it gold hoarding, but your behavior becomes hoarding of certainty. When you feel socially unsafe, you do the same thing with identity. You curate your image like it's a currency. You post what you want people to see. You avoid what threatens the narrative. You choose friends and partners based on what makes you look secure rather than what makes you actually safe. And when someone challenges your story, you defend it with emotion rather than evidence.